In front of the entire hospital staff, Director Darius Cole ripped the badge from Claire Whitfield's chest and fired her on the spot. His voice echoed through the main hall as he mocked her, calling her nothing more than a nurse who dared question a man in power. Claire said nothing. She simply turned and walked away holding an old cream-colored envelope her father had left her years ago. Darius had no idea that the woman he just humiliated controlled the very hospital he ran. What happens when that envelope finally opens? If stories like this keep you hooked, hit that follow button so you never miss what happens next. Claire Whitfield had once been the kind of medical student professors bragged about at dinner parties, the one expected to finish her residency before she turned 30 and land wherever she wanted. That future ended quietly without announcement the year her father was diagnosed with an illness that had no good outcomes. She withdrew from her scholarship program without telling most of her classmates why, packed her things into her car, and drove 3 hours back to the house she grew up in to become a caregiver instead of a doctor. For the 2 years that followed, her world shrank to hospital corridors, medication schedules, and the sound of her father's breathing machine at night. When he passed, she did not go back to finish her degree. Something in her had changed, and the idea of climbing toward a title felt hollow compared to what she had just lived through. Instead, she took a nursing position at Ashford General, the same hospital where her father had spent his final months, telling herself it was the closest she could get to honoring what those years had taught her. What Claire did not know, because her father had never once mentioned it in all their conversations at his bedside, was that he had built the very institution she now worked inside. Decades earlier, he had founded a private holding company called Vantage Health Holdings, and Ashford General had grown out of that foundation brick by brick. He had kept his name off every plaque and every letterhead on purpose, believing that a man's true character only showed itself when he assumed no one important was watching. Before he died, he handed Claire a cream-colored envelope sealed and unlabeled and asked her to promise something strange. He told her not to open it until the day a person in power revealed exactly who they really were to her. At the time, exhausted and grieving, she assumed it was simply the kind of cryptic thing dying men said, and she tucked the envelope into a drawer and mostly forgot about it. Years passed and the drawer stayed shut. At Ashford General, Claire became the kind of nurse other staff quietly relied on. She volunteered for the overnight shifts. Nobody wanted sat with the most frightened patients until they fell asleep and stepped between younger nurses and doctors who tried to intimidate them. None of it earned her recognition on paper, but it earned her something harder to fake, which was trust from the people who worked beside her every single day. The hospital's new executive director, a man named Darius Cole, represented everything Claire had learned to be wary of. He was sharp, ambitious, and undeniably capable of making numbers move in the right direction, but he carried himself like someone who believed nurses existed to follow instructions rather than raise concerns. In his mind, doctors built reputations, directors built profit margins, and everyone beneath that line simply executed what they were told. Darius was in the middle of negotiating an expansion deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, one that would fold Ashford General into a larger regional health network. If the deal closed, he stood to be named chief executive over the entire system, a promotion he had been chasing for years. To make the numbers attractive to investors, his plan involved shutting down the hospital's community clinic, laying off dozens of longtime nurses, and redirecting that budget toward a luxury treatment wing for wealthy patients. Around this same time, Claire noticed something small that she chose not to dwell on. Evelyn Shaw, the hospital's associate director and one of Darius's closest allies, had started finding reasons to strike up casual conversation with her. Evelyn asked about Claire's father, once phrased lightly, almost like small talk, wondering aloud what kind of estate a man leaves behind after decades of medical bills. Claire found the question a little odd, but she brushed it off as idle curiosity from someone trying to be friendly, and the moment slipped out of her mind almost as quickly as it arrived. The turning point came during a night shift that should have been routine. A patient in the intensive care unit began deteriorating rapidly, and Claire discovered that staffing on the floor had been quietly cut that week under a directive from Darius's office, all in the name of trimming costs before the tornado. Expansion deal closed. With fewer hands available to monitor him, the patient's condition worsened past the point where early intervention could have made a difference. When the incident reached Darius, his first move was not to examine the staffing decision that caused it. Instead, he looked for someone to blame, and his attention landed on a young nurse who had been on shift that night, someone with far less standing to defend herself. Claire refused to let that happen. She pulled the shift logs herself, laid out the timeline in front of hospital leadership, and showed exactly how the reduced staffing, not any individual nurse's mistake, had created the gap that endangered the patient. Darius did not see accountability in what Claire had done. He saw defiance, and worse, he saw it happening in front of people whose opinions mattered to his career. Rather than address the problem quietly, he called an all-staff meeting in the hospital's main lobby, gathering doctors, nurses, and administrative employees under the pretense of addressing patient safety concerns. What followed was the moment that would define everything after it. In front of the entire assembled staff, Darius walked directly up to Claire, tore her employee badge from her chest, and told her she was finished at Ashford General. He said it loudly enough for the back rows to hear, adding that a nurse had no business questioning the judgment of the man running the hospital. Claire tried to explain that patients had nearly died because of the very decision he refused to take responsibility for, but Darius had already made his decision, and he had made it publicly on purpose. He motioned for security, and 2 guards escorted her toward the doors while hundreds of coworkers watched in silence. Not one department head, not one senior physician stepped forward to defend her, even though many of them had leaned on her kindness more than once. Claire walked out through the sliding glass doors and into the parking lot without looking back, refusing to give Darius the satisfaction of seeing her break down. It was only once she reached her car alone and finally out of view that the weight of what had just happened caught up with her. Sitting behind the wheel, she reached into her bag out of habit rather than intention, and her fingers brushed against the edge of an old cream-colored envelope she had carried without quite remembering why. She understood almost the instant she saw it that this was the day her father had been talking about. She tore it open right there in the driver's seat. Inside was nothing dramatic, just a small card bearing the name of an attorney, Solomon Reed, a phone number, and a single handwritten line urging her not to sign anything until she spoke with him first. The next morning, Claire drove to the address printed beneath Solomon's name, half expecting a cold formal meeting about paperwork. What she found instead was a man visibly moved the moment he saw her walk through his door, someone who had clearly been waiting years for this conversation. Solomon had known her father not just professionally but personally, having served as both his attorney and, in the final years, one of the few people her father trusted enough to visit him privately. Before he opened a single file, Solomon told her a memory that made her chest tighten, describing how her father had insisted on being wheeled down to the community clinic every week during his own treatment, refusing to let his illness stop him from checking in on patients who had nowhere else to go. It was a version of her father Claire recognized completely, and hearing it from someone outside the family made the loss feel fresh again in a way she hadn't expected walking in that morning. Only after that did Solomon explain why her father had sent her to him. Her father, he said, had not simply left behind savings or a modest inheritance. He had left behind a trust that controlled a wide portfolio of real estate and medical enterprises, all of it organized under a parent company called Vantage Health Holdings. Claire felt something shift the moment she heard the name, because it was the same name buried in paperwork she had glimpsed once or twice without ever asking what it meant, the very company that owned Ashford General. Solomon did not lay out everything at once. He told her plainly that Darius was currently pushing forward a deal tied directly to assets her father had built, and that this fact alone made the timing of her firing worth paying close attention to. He also added something she would only understand the significance of much later, explaining that her father had never fully trusted any single system to hold his most important records, and had always kept an independent backup of critical files completely separate from whatever infrastructure the hospital itself relied on. Claire left Solomon's office with more questions than answers, but one thing had become unavoidably clear. She could walk away entirely, accept the humiliation of that morning, and start over somewhere far from Ashford General, or she could quietly dig into what her father had left behind and find out exactly what Darius was building on top of it. Standing in the parking lot for the second time in 2 days, she thought not of her own reputation but of the nurses on that layoff list and the patients who depended on the clinic Darius intended to shut down. She made her decision before she even reached her car. This was no longer about getting her job back or clearing her name in front of people who had stayed silent while she was dragged out the door. It was about understanding what her father had actually built and making sure the man who tore her badge off in front of everyone did not get to tear down what came after it. Following Solomon's advice, Claire made no attempt to announce who she was or what she now suspected. Instead, she moved carefully, reaching out to former coworkers she trusted enough to ask quiet questions, people who had worked alongside her long enough to know she would never fabricate a claim against the hospital. What she uncovered within the first week confirmed something she had feared since the moment Darius tore her badge off in front of everyone. The official incident report filed after the intensive care unit crisis had been rewritten. In Darius's version of events, Claire had acted outside proper procedure, ignored established protocol, and endangered a patient through her own interference rather than exposing a staffing cut that had put the patient at risk in the first place. Worse, Darius had circulated a notice to partner hospitals across the region, flagging Claire under a professional conduct warning that effectively closed most doors before she could even walk through them. The threat extended beyond her job. With her name marked for dangerous professional behavior, her nursing license itself was now vulnerable to review, something that could end her career entirely regardless of what actually happened that night. Claire understood that Darius had not simply fired her out of anger. He had moved methodically to make sure she could never resurface anywhere in the industry to contradict his version of events. A former colleague working in the hospital's records department, someone who had once cried in Claire's arms after losing her first patient and never forgotten the kindness, quietly slipped her a copy of the expansion contract Darius had been finalizing. Reading through it at her kitchen table that night, Claire saw exactly how deep his plans went. The community clinic, the one her father had apparently visited weekly during his final years without her ever knowing the connection, was slated for sale to an outside investment group. Hundreds of jobs would disappear and low-income patients who relied on that clinic would have nowhere left to turn. Near the final pages of the contract sat a clause that stopped Claire cold. The deal could only be legally executed with approval from the majority owner of Vantage Health Holdings, and according to the paperwork in front of her, that approval had already been granted months earlier. Claire had never signed anything in her life related to a company she hadn't even known existed until a few days ago. Someone had forged the signature of an heir who did not yet know she was one. She brought this discovery straight to Solomon, and this time he did not hold anything back. Sitting across from her in his office, he finally laid out the full picture her father had spent years protecting. Decades earlier, her father had founded Vantage Health Holdings and built Ashford General from nothing, deliberately keeping his name off every sign, every letterhead, every public record tied to the institution. He believed, Solomon explained, that people only reveal their true character when they assume no one powerful is watching them. After her father passed, ownership of everything had transferred into a trust, and Claire was its only heir. She did not simply own a stake in the hospital that had just fired her. She owned the parent company, controlling it entirely, along with every decision Darius had made, under the assumption that no one with real authority would ever question him. The woman he had called nothing more than a nurse in front of hundreds of witnesses held the power to end his career with a single signature, or the refusal of one. Solomon warned her immediately that she could not simply walk in and announce herself. Darius had already used a forged signature to push the deal forward, which meant he was capable of destroying evidence, shifting blame onto subordinates, or rushing the sale through before her succession could be formally recognized. If he learned what Claire had discovered too soon, he would have every incentive to bury it faster than she could stop him. From that point forward, everything about Claire's fight changed. She was no longer trying to reclaim a job or clear her name from a falsified report. She was trying to stop a man from stealing an institution her father had spent his life building, and from erasing the last thing connecting her to him. Darius, meanwhile, began sensing that someone was digging into his affairs, though he did not yet know it was Claire herself. He responded by tightening his grip on anyone who had worked near her, warning department heads that leaking internal records would result in immediate termination. An older nurse named Patricia Hale, who had worked at Ashford General for over 20 years, agreed to formally testify that Darius had personally ordered the staffing cuts in the intensive care unit. Within a day of that agreement becoming known, Patricia was suspended on unrelated disciplinary grounds that surfaced suspiciously fast. Darius went further, ordering the security footage from the night of the incident deleted and quietly altering timestamps across several patient records to blur the timeline of what actually happened. He believed he was covering every angle, unaware that the daughter of the man who built the hospital was now watching his every move from outside the building he thought he fully controlled. It was during this period that Evelyn Shaw resurfaced, and this time there was nothing casual about the conversation. Evelyn requested a private meeting, and when Claire arrived, it became clear almost immediately that Evelyn already suspected far more than idle curiosity had led on weeks earlier. She told Claire plainly that she knew about the Vantage connection, and she came with an offer rather than a threat, at least on the surface. Evelyn proposed a simple arrangement. Claire would approve the expansion deal, stay quiet about the forged signature buried in the contract, and in exchange receive a significant financial payout along with help restoring her nursing license through connections Evelyn claimed to have. If Claire refused, Evelyn made it clear that a heavily edited version of the intensive care unit footage would be released publicly. One crafted to make Claire look like an unstable nurse who endangered patients out of recklessness. Because Claire had never fully trusted the warmth Evelyn projected back when they first met, she had taken a precaution before walking into that meeting. She asked a coworker she trusted completely to hold her phone in a jacket left just outside the room, recording quietly the entire time. It was not luck that captured what happened next. It was the same instinct that had told her weeks earlier that Evelyn's questions about her father's estate were never simple small talk. Claire declined the offer calmly, without raising her voice or giving Evelyn the reaction she seemed to be waiting for. Evelyn had no idea the entire exchange, including her own words about bribery and manipulated footage, now existed as a recording outside that room. Believing she still held every advantage, Evelyn reported back to Darius that Claire refused to cooperate, and Darius wasted no time responding. He convened a formal disciplinary hearing in front of the hospital's professional review board, presenting the doctored footage as evidence that Claire had acted recklessly during the incident alongside the falsified report already circulating among partner hospitals. The board, seeing only what Darius allowed them to see, voted to suspend her nursing license pending further investigation. Darius left that hearing believing he had permanently dismantled whatever credibility Claire had left. He did not stop there. Sensing an opportunity to finish things entirely, Darius moved the signing date of the expansion deal forward, choosing to unveil it publicly at the hospital's annual gala, an event drawing board members, major investors, and members of the press. If the contract were finalized that night, the community clinic would transfer ownership almost immediately, and reversing a completed sale would become far harder even for someone with Claire's rightful claim. The pressure compounded quickly after that. Patricia, Claire's key witness, withdrew her statement entirely after her family began receiving anonymous messages tied to her job security. Darius's office reported that the server holding the original intensive care unit footage had suffered a technical failure and could no longer be recovered, a claim he repeated confidently to anyone who asked. What he did not know, and what Solomon quietly moved to confirm the moment the gala date was announced, was that Claire's father had never trusted any single server to hold something that important. Solomon reached out to a small technology firm that had maintained an independent backup system for Vantage Health Holdings, for years entirely separate from anything Ashford General controlled internally, and within days he had the original footage sitting securely in his own possession, unknown to anyone at the hospital. In public statements to hospital staff, Darius painted Claire as a bitter former employee fabricating a personal vendetta after being justly terminated for misconduct. As if that were not enough, his legal team filed a court motion seeking to delay formal recognition of Claire's inheritance rights, citing the very misconduct investigation Darius himself had orchestrated as grounds for suspicion. Solomon moved quickly to oppose the motion, filing a response that laid out, in careful legal language, the timeline of the falsified report and the suspicious speed with which the accusations against Claire had appeared. A judge agreed to review both filings side by side rather than granting Darius's request outright, leaving the matter unresolved, but no longer working entirely in his favor. Sitting in Solomon's office as all of this unfolded within a matter of days, Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her in a way it hadn't even in the parking lot the night she was fired. Solomon, watching her carefully, suggested for the first time that stepping back might be the wiser path, protecting what remained of her reputation rather than walking into a legal battle stacked so heavily against her. Claire sat with that suggestion for a long moment, turning it over honestly rather than dismissing it out of pride. But her mind kept returning to Patricia, suspended for telling the truth, and to the list of nurses set to lose their jobs the moment that clinic changed hands. She thought of the patients who had nowhere else to go, the same kind of patients her father had insisted on visiting every week even while dying himself. She decided she would attend the gala. She would not wear a suit meant to announce power, and she would not walk in with any staff badge to lend her credibility because she no longer had one. She would carry only the envelope her father left her and a thin folder of documents Solomon had helped her assemble, and she would find out once and for all whether the truth still meant anything inside the building her father had built to protect people who had nowhere else to turn. The annual gala at Ashford General filled the hospital's largest conference hall with round tables draped in white linen, board members in formal wear, and investors who had flown in specifically to witness the signing everyone expected. That night, Darius stood near the stage rehearsing his remarks under his breath, confident that within the hour his name would be attached to the largest expansion in the hospital's history. He had spent weeks imagining this moment, and nothing in his preparation accounted for the possibility that it might not go according to plan. When he finally took the podium, Darius spoke with the practiced ease of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. He described the expansion as the beginning of a new era of profitability for Ashford General, one built on efficiency and difficult but necessary decisions. At one point, without any apparent hesitation, he referenced Claire's termination, directly holding her up as an example of what happened to employees who refused to adapt to the hospital's new direction. Just before the contract signing was set to begin, the chair of the board stepped forward to announce something billed as a routine formality, a ceremonial reading of the newly confirmed successor to controlling ownership of Vantage Health Holdings. The judge reviewing Darius's motion to delay that recognition had only the day before declined to grant the delay, finding no credible evidence to support pausing a legally established inheritance. Darius had received the ruling quietly through his legal team and chosen not to mention it to anyone, still believing he could control how the evening unfolded. As far as the rest of the room understood it, this reading was simply paperwork unrelated to anything happening on that stage. The chairman opened a sealed folder and read the name aloud. Claire Whitfield. The room went completely still, the kind of silence that seems to swallow even the sound of glasses being set down. Heads turned toward the entrance almost in unison, as if the crowd needed to see for themselves whether they had heard correctly. Claire walked in wearing a plain black suit, nothing about her appearance suggesting wealth or ceremony, yet every eye in the room followed her as she crossed toward the stage. She passed doctors and nurses who had stood in that same lobby weeks earlier, watching in silence as security escorted her out the front doors. None of them said a word now either, though the silence this time felt entirely different. She stepped up to the podium and looked directly at Darius before speaking. She reminded the room in a steady voice that carried without needing to rise that only days ago this same man had ripped her employee badge from her chest and declared that a nurse had no right to question the director of a hospital. She told him he had actually been right about one thing that night, though not in the way he meant it. She was no longer standing there as an employee at all. Claire announced what Solomon had confirmed weeks earlier in a quiet office, far from any of this attention. Her father had founded Vantage Health Holdings decades before building Ashford General from the ground up, while deliberately keeping his name off every wall and every document tied to the institution. As his only heir, she was now the rightful successor to full ownership of the company, controlling the hospital along with every subsidiary and asset attached to it, including the very stage Darius currently stood on. Darius's composure cracked almost immediately. He argued that Claire's nursing license remained under suspension pending an active misconduct investigation, insisting that whatever paperwork the board was reading meant nothing next to that fact. Claire answered without raising her voice, telling him plainly that her professional license had never determined who owned this hospital, and that no amount of authority on his part could turn a forged signature into something legitimate. She then addressed the expansion contract, directly stating for the record that she refused to approve it. The deal Darius had staked his entire career on collapsed in that single sentence, though Claire made clear this was only the beginning of what the room was about to learn. Solomon stepped up beside her, carrying a folder of his own, and what followed unraveled everything Darius believed he had successfully buried. Solomon explained that the approval signature on the expansion contract had been forged months earlier, well before Claire had ever learned her father's true history. He then revealed that the intensive care unit footage Darius's office claimed had been lost to a server failure had never actually disappeared at all, having existed the entire time on an independent backup system her father established years before his death, specifically because he trusted no single system completely. The full footage confirmed exactly what Claire had said from the very beginning, that she had acted to save a patient's life after Darius's own staffing cuts put him in danger, not the other way around. Solomon added for the board's benefit that the investigators now standing near the back of the room had been contacted quietly by his office in the days leading up to tonight, once the falsified signature and altered records made clear that criminal conduct, not simply a business dispute, was involved. Then came the recording. Solomon played the conversation captured weeks earlier in that private meeting, the one Evelyn believed had disappeared into nothing more than a quiet arrangement between two women who understood each other. Evelyn's voice filled the hall, clearly offering Claire money and a restored license in exchange for silence and threatening manipulated footage if she refused. There was no ambiguity left in what the board was hearing, no room for Darius to reframe it as a misunderstanding. The investigators who had been quietly briefed by Solomon's office rose from their seats near the back of the room. Darius turned toward Evelyn, searching her face for some kind of support, but she had already begun putting distance between herself and him, telling anyone within earshot that she had merely been following instructions handed down from his office. Whatever partnership had existed between them dissolved the moment consequences became real. The board did not deliberate long. Darius's suspension as executive director was announced before he had even fully processed what was happening, and hospital security, the same department he had once used to escort Claire out the front doors, now approached the stage to collect his executive credentials. He looked down at the badge in his own hand for a long moment, the weight of the parallel clearly registering somewhere behind his eyes. Notifications began appearing almost immediately on the screens near the stage entrance, confirming what the board had just enacted. Executive system access revoked. Administrative accounts locked. Financial authorization suspended pending review. Employment contract under formal termination proceedings. Darius tried to reach for the microphone one final time, hoping to salvage some explanation in front of the investors still watching, but the board chairman stepped between him and the stand, telling him plainly that his opportunity to speak had already ended. He walked out of that same conference hall in complete silence, past board members, investors, and members of his own staff, who had applauded his speech less than an hour earlier. It was the same building where he had once humiliated a woman in front of hundreds of witnesses, and now he left it having received exactly the kind of public reckoning he had shown no hesitation delivering to someone else. In the weeks that followed, Darius faced formal investigation on multiple fronts, including forging corporate signatures, falsifying patient records, intimidating a witness, and knowingly covering up a staffing decision that had endangered a patient's life. Evelyn cooperated with investigators in an effort to reduce her own exposure, offering details that further confirmed the scope of what Darius had orchestrated, though her cooperation did not save her position. She was removed from hospital leadership entirely once the full picture emerged. Claire's nursing license was formally reinstated once the complete footage and accurate shift records were reviewed by the same board that had suspended it weeks earlier. Patricia, the nurse who had been suspended shortly after agreeing to testify against Darius, was reinstated as well, and hospital leadership extended protection and support to every employee who had faced pressure or threats during the weeks. Darius fought to keep his deal alive. The nurses whose names had appeared on the layoff list tied to the expansion deal were formally notified that their positions were no longer at risk, now that the sale itself had collapsed. On the following Monday morning, Claire returned to Ashford General wearing her nursing uniform rather than anything resembling the formal attire expected of someone who now controlled the company that owned the building. When the sliding glass doors opened and she stepped inside, the entire lobby fell quiet in a way that echoed the silence from the night she had been fired, though everything about this silence felt entirely reversed. Patricia was the first to stand, rising from behind the nurses' station to begin applauding before anyone else moved. Younger nurses followed next, then physicians, then the front desk staff, and eventually patients waiting nearby who had no idea why the room had erupted but joined in anyway. Someone near the front said quietly that it was good to have her home. Claire looked around at the faces surrounding her and answered simply that titles could change, but the responsibility to care for patients never did. Claire formally accepted her role atop Vantage Health Holdings in the weeks that followed, though she refused to run the company from behind a closed office door somewhere far from the patients it served. She established a new leadership council that gave nurses, physicians, technical staff, and patient representatives an actual voice in decisions affecting the hospital, something Ashford General had never structured itself around before. The plan to sell the community clinic was canceled entirely, and in its place Claire expanded that same clinic into a fully funded center offering free care to women, children, and low-income families across the region, naming it after her father. In the main lobby, she hung a photograph of him seated in his wheelchair, the same image Solomon had described the day they first met, taken during one of his weekly visits to the clinic he insisted on seeing even while dying. Beneath the photograph, she had a simple inscription placed on the wall stating that power does not reveal who a person truly is, but the way someone treats those who can offer them nothing in return always does. Claire kept the badge Darius had torn from her chest that first night, sealing it inside a small glass frame she placed on her own desk. It was not there to remind her of the humiliation she had felt walking out those doors, but to remind her that a hospital is never built by the people sitting in its highest offices. It is built by the people willing to stand beside a patient's bed when no one else remains to do so. The story closes on an image of Claire walking down a familiar hospital corridor months later, staff members greeting her now as chairwoman as she passes. She stops beside an elderly patient resting near the window, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders and offering a quiet smile before continuing on her way. Long before she ever owned a single share of the hospital, she had been a nurse first, and of every title she now carried, that remained the one she was proudest to answer to. The lesson carried through every part of what happened at Ashford General remains simple enough to sit with long after the story ends. Never underestimate a person because of the title they currently hold. The person you humiliate today may very well be the one holding your future in her hands tomorrow. If this story reminded you that kindness and character matter more than any title, subscribe and follow the channel for more stories just like it, and we'll see you in the next one.